The sun rises over the ruins of Mesopotamia. Beneath the dust of modern Iraq lie tablets of clay, inscribed with the oldest writing known to man. For centuries, the beings described in these cuneiform scripts have been called gods. They are often imagined as celestial giants descending from the heavens to shape humanity. But a closer look at the ancient texts reveals a different story. These are not descriptions of divine miracles, but of desperate measures. The Anunnaki do not arrive with the effortless power of deities. They arrive with tools, with hunger, and with the heavy burden of a dying world behind them. New translations suggest these figures are not objects of worship, but refugees of a cosmic catastrophe. They are survivors seeking a foothold in the fertile silt of the Tigris and Euphrates. Today, the origins of civilization are re-examined as a story of survival. The sun hangs heavy and unmoving over the flat, scorched plains of southern Iraq. Here, in the cradle of the world, the wind carries a fine, pale dust that coats everything in a layer of the ancient past. This is the site of Eridu, what the Sumerians believed was the first city ever built. It is a place where the horizon blurs in the heat, shimmering like a lake that is not there. In this landscape of salt and silt, the foundations of the modern world were laid down thousands of years ago. We are not looking for gold or jewels, but for something far more resilient. We are looking for clay. Archaeologists kneel in the trenches, their brushes moving with the precision of surgeons. They sweep away the debris of millennia to reveal small, pillow-shaped rectangles of sun-baked earth. These are the tablets. When they were first pressed with the triangular tip of a reed stylus, the clay was wet and pliable. Now, they are as hard as stone, carrying marks that look like the tracks of birds across a muddy bank. This is cuneiform, the first true writing system of humanity. For over a century, these tablets were read as mythology. They were dismissed as the fevered dreams of a Bronze Age priesthood, stories of fickle gods who lived in the clouds and commanded the lightning. But a new perspective is emerging. When the language is stripped of its religious veneer and the archaic metaphors are translated with a technical eye, a different story begins to breathe through the dust. The story centers on a figure named Enki. In traditional scholarship, he is the god of water, knowledge, and creation. He is often depicted with streams of water flowing from his shoulders, filled with leaping fish. However, the earliest Sumerian texts, such as the Eridu Genesis and the Atrahasis, do not describe him as a spirit or an abstract concept. They describe him as a person with specific needs, physical limitations, and a highly advanced understanding of the material world. He is the leader of a group known as the Anunnaki. This term is usually translated as those of royal blood or those who from heaven came to earth. But if we move away from the supernatural, the translation becomes more literal. They are the ones who arrived. To understand the Anunnaki as survivors, we must look at the specific details the Sumerians chose to record. They did not describe their arrival as a magical manifestation. Instead, they spoke of heavy crafts that landed in the marshes, of the smoke and fire that accompanied their descent, and of the long, grueling work that followed. These were not the actions of omnipotent deities who could simply wish a civilization into existence. These were the actions of a crew. The texts tell us that the Anunnaki spent tens of thousands of years performing backbreaking labor. They dug out the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They built dikes and canals to control the seasonal floods. They were engineers struggling against a wild, untamed environment. The narrator walks along the edge of a deep excavation pit, the shadows lengthening as the day wanes. The camera lingers on a particularly well-preserved tablet held in the gloved hand of a researcher. The marks are dense and complex. This is the record of Enki and the world order. In this text, Enki is not presiding over a celestial court. He is traveling across the land in a vehicle he calls his ibex of the Abzu. He is surveying the territory, organizing the labor force, and establishing the first outposts of what would become the Sumerian Empire. He behaves less like a god and more like a high-ranking official or a chief scientist tasked with a desperate mission. The central question that has haunted translators for decades is why. Why would a group of beings with such immense power spend centuries digging in the mud? The tablets provide a startling answer that traditional history often ignores. They speak of a crisis on the home world of the Anunnaki. They describe an atmosphere that was thinning, a planet that was losing its ability to retain heat and support life. Their survival depended on a very specific resource that they could not find in sufficient quantities anywhere else. They came for gold. To a modern ear, this sounds like the plot of a science fiction novel. But the Sumerian texts are remarkably specific about the use of this gold. It was not used for currency or decoration. It was processed, refined, and launched back into the sky. The texts describe it being suspended in the air to create a shield. In the context of modern science, we know that gold is an extraordinary conductor and a highly effective shield against radiation. If a civilization were facing an atmospheric collapse, suspended particles of gold could, in theory, reflect harmful rays and stabilize the temperature of a planet. The Anunnaki were not here on a religious crusade. They were here on a mining expedition to save their species. This shift in perspective changes everything we thought we knew about the origins of human culture. If the Anunnaki were survivors, then the temples we see in ruins across the Iraqi desert were not houses of worship. They were functional structures. The Sumerian word for temple is which literally means house. The Iabzu, the house of Enki in Eridu, was his primary residence and laboratory. It was a place of high technology that the local inhabitants could not comprehend. To a primitive hunter-gatherer, a being who can communicate across vast distances, illuminate the night with artificial light, and heal the sick with a touch is indistinguishable from a god. The divinity of the Anunnaki was a matter of perspective, a gap in understanding between those who possessed advanced knowledge and those who were only beginning to learn. As we look closer at the cuneiform signs, we see evidence of a hierarchy that was anything but divine. There was tension, dissent, and eventually a full-scale mutiny. The lower-ranking Anunnaki, those tasked with the actual mining operations in the deep pits of the earth, grew tired of their endless toil. The tablets record their complaints in vivid detail. They speak of the heat, the darkness, and the crushing weight of the earth. They chose a leader and marched on the house of Enlil, the commander of the expedition. They burned their tools and demanded a solution. This is the moment where the story of the Anunnaki and the story of humanity become inextricably linked. Enki, the scientist, proposed a radical solution to the labor crisis. He did not suggest that they work harder or that they abandon the mission. He suggested they create a new kind of worker. He proposed taking a creature that already existed on the earth, a primitive hominid, and elevating it. The texts describe a process of mixing the essence of an Anunnaki with the clay of the earth. In the light of modern genetics, the term essence takes on a new meaning. It is not a mystical soul, but the biological blueprint of a species. They were not creating life from nothing. They were performing a genetic upgrade. The result of this experiment was the Lulu, the primitive worker. This was the first human. We were designed to be the laborers that the Anunnaki no longer wanted to be. We were the solution to their survival crisis. This realization casts a long, cold shadow over our understanding of ourselves. We have spent thousands of years looking at the stars and wondering if we are alone, or looking at the ruins of Mesopotamia and wondering why our ancestors worshipped such demanding gods. The answer may be hidden in plain sight, written in the dust of Enki. We were not created out of divine love. We were created out of operational necessity. The camera pans across the vast, empty desert, where the only sound is the whistling of the wind through the crumbling brickwork of a ziggurat. These massive stepped pyramids were the final remnants of that era. They were the landing pads and the administrative hubs of the survivors. Now, they are silent monuments to a history that was forgotten and then rewritten as myth. But the tablets remain. They are the physical evidence of a time when the world was shared by two different kinds of people, the survivors from above and the workers they left behind. Decoding these texts is a slow and painstaking process. Every year, new fragments are found, and every year, our understanding of the Sumerian language becomes more nuanced. We are beginning to see that the history of our species is much older and much more complex than the standard narrative allows. We are beginning to see that we are not the masters of this world, but the descendants of a grand and desperate experiment. The dust that covers the tablets of Enki is finally being swept away, and underneath, we find not the stories of gods, but the blueprints of our own survival. The survivors did not leave because they wanted to. They left because their mission was complete, leaving us to find our own way in the world they built for us. As we continue to translate these ancient records, we are not just learning about the past. We are discovering the true nature of our origin and the silent, technical hand that shaped our destiny. The story of the Anunnaki is not over. It is only just beginning to be told. The image of a dying world is not one of sudden explosions or theatrical fire. It is a slow, quiet surrender to the cold. On the planet the Sumerians call Nibiru, the sky is no longer a protective canopy but a leaking sieve. The atmosphere, once thick and vibrant, is thinning. For a civilization that has reached the pinnacle of technological mastery, there is a profound irony in their predicament. They have conquered the secrets of the atom and the mysteries of the stars, yet they cannot hold onto the air they breathe. The Anunnaki look up at a sun that provides less and less warmth as their eccentric orbit carries them into the long, dark winter of the outer solar system. This is the setting described in the oldest layers of the Mesopotamian tradition. It is a narrative of planetary distress. The texts do not speak of a spiritual fall from grace, but a physical collapse of an ecosystem. The internal heat of their world, the vital force generated by its core, is radiating away into the void. Without a stable atmosphere to trap this warmth, the cities of the Anunnaki are turning into tombs of ice. Their scientists, whom the tablets call the masters of wisdom, conclude that the only way to save their home is to create an artificial shield. They need to weave a golden veil around their planet, a layer of ionized gold particles that will reflect heat back toward the surface and deflect the lethal cosmic radiation of the deep. But Nibiru is a world of refined minerals and depleted resources. The gold they require does not exist in the quantities necessary to save a world. The survival of their entire race hinges on a single desperate mission. They must find a source of this precious metal elsewhere in the solar system. They must become voyagers, not out of a desire for conquest, but out of the raw necessity of biological survival. The departure is not the triumphant launch of an empire. It is an exodus. The Sumerian accounts describe the selection of the crew and the preparation of the craft. These are not chariots of fire in a literal sense, but metallic vessels designed to withstand the crushing pressures and the radiation of the vacuum. The tablets describe the internal chambers of these ships, the life support systems, and the navigation tools. The Anunnaki who board these vessels are not confident gods. They are scientists, soldiers, and laborers who know that they may never see their home world again. They are leaving behind a planet of amber light and cooling winds for the absolute black of the void. The journey across the solar system is a perilous transit through a graveyard of celestial debris. The Sumerian texts refer to the asteroid belt as the hammered bracelet, a chaotic region of rock and ice that stands like a wall between the outer planets and the inner sun. This is where the divinity of the Anunnaki is truly tested and found wanting. They are not masters of the universe who can simply wish away the laws of physics. They are subject to the same mechanical failures and navigation errors as any biological species. Some of their ships are lost. The texts speak of collisions and the loss of life, recorded with a cold, observational precision that lacks the flowery metaphors of later religious mythology. For those who survive the crossing of the hammered bracelet, the destination comes into view. It is the 7th planet in their counting, a world of swirling blues and deep greens, wrapped in a thick, protective atmosphere. To the Anunnaki, Earth is a wild, untamed frontier. It is a planet overflowing with the one thing they need most. Gold is present in the veins of its mountains and the silt of its rivers. But Earth is also a world of high gravity, unpredictable weather, and strange, primitive life forms. When the first craft breaks through the terrestrial clouds, the occupants do not see a Garden of Eden. They see a swampy, prehistoric landscape. The descent is heavy. The gravity of Earth pulls at their bodies, which are evolved for a different environment. Their movements are slow and labored. Their skin, sensitive to the unfiltered rays of a younger, hotter sun, requires protection. Every step taken on the mud of the Persian Gulf is a testament to their fragility. The earliest settlements, such as the one named Eridu, are not cities of marble and gold built for the worship of deities. They are functional outposts. They are modular habitats designed for survival. The Sumerian word for these early structures often translates to house, but the context suggests something more akin to a laboratory or a barracks. There is a sense of urgency in these early days. The clock is ticking for the home world. Every ounce of gold recovered must be processed and sent back to Nibiru. The leadership of this expedition is divided. We see the emergence of 2 central figures who will dominate the narrative for millennia. Enki, the master of water and technology, is the chief scientist. He is the one who understands the biology of the new world and the mechanics of the extraction. His half-brother, Enlil, is the commander, the one responsible for logistics, discipline, and the ultimate success of the mission. The tension between them is not a battle of good versus evil. It is a conflict of methodology. One is driven by the empathy of a creator and a scientist, the other by the cold calculation of a military leader tasked with saving a species at any cost. As the years turn into centuries, the physical toll on the Anunnaki becomes apparent. They are biological beings, and although their lifespans are vast compared to humans, they are not infinite. They age. They suffer from the diseases of the earth. The radiation of the sun and the alien bacteria of the soil begin to wear them down. The texts describe their complaints, their weariness, and eventually, their rebellion. The labor of mining the gold is backbreaking. The Anunnaki are elite specialists, not common laborers, and the heat of the African mines and the humidity of the Mesopotamian marshes push them to the breaking point. The documentary evidence provided by the clay tablets suggests a pivotal moment in this history. The rank and file workers, the ones tasked with the actual extraction of the ore, refuse to continue. They burn their tools. They surround the dwelling of Enlil in a show of force. This is the first recorded labor strike in history, but its scale is planetary. The mission is at a standstill. The home world is still dying, and the workers on Earth have reached the limit of their endurance. This crisis forces a radical proposal. If the Anunnaki can no longer perform the labor, they must find something else to do it for them. But there is no other species on Earth capable of the complex tasks required for mining and refining gold. The indigenous hominids are too primitive, too wild. The solution that Enki proposes is one that will change the course of planetary history forever. He suggests a biological intervention. He proposes to use the genetic material of the Anunnaki themselves to upgrade the existing species of the Earth. This is not an act of divine creation in the sense of breathing life into dust. It is a laboratory procedure. The tablets describe the mixing of the blood, which we might today recognize as DNA, with the clay of the Earth, perhaps a metaphor for the biological building blocks or the gestational environment. The goal is to create a worker, a primitive laborer who is intelligent enough to follow orders and use tools, but resilient enough to handle the harsh conditions of the mines. This decision marks the transition from a rescue mission to a colonization. The Anunnaki are no longer just survivors fleeing a void. They have become architects of life. Yet, as they look upon their creations, the first humans, they do not see children or worshippers. They see a temporary solution to a logistical problem. They do not realize that they have set in motion a sequence of events that will eventually lead to their own obsolescence. The home world remains a distant, fading memory. The gold continues to be shipped into the sky, but the bond between the survivors on Earth and the civilization they left behind is beginning to fray. They are becoming more of the Earth and less of the stars. The environment they came to exploit is slowly claiming them. The atmospheric shield of Nibiru may be holding, but the souls of those sent to save it are being transformed by the very world they intended to strip of its riches. The cataclysm of the home world drove them here, but the reality of Earth will keep them here. They are a race in exile, hiding their desperation behind the facade of power. To the primitive humans they have created, they appear as gods because of their technology and their longevity. But in the quiet moments within their pressurized habitats, they are simply survivors, haunted by the ghost of a world they can no longer truly call home. The void they fled is not just the space between the stars, but the emptiness of a future where they are no longer the masters of their own destiny. The sky above the southern marshes of Mesopotamia does not part for gods. Tears open for the desperate. In the ancient world, the arrival of the Anunnaki is often portrayed as a celestial procession, a glorious descent of golden beings. But the earliest cuneiform fragments, when read without the filter of later religious dogma, tell a story of a much more brutal reality. The landing at Eridu is not an act of colonization. It is an act of survival. 40 miles south of the modern city of Nazariah, the ruins of Eridu sit as a mound of dust and salt. In the distant past, this was the edge of the world. It was a place where the fresh waters of the subterranean aquifers met the salt of the Persian Gulf. To the Sumerians, Eridu was the first city. They claimed that before Eridu, there was only the vast primordial marsh. When we look at the oldest levels of the archaeological site, beneath the layers of temples and palaces, we find something startling. we find evidence of a sudden, sophisticated intervention in a landscape that had previously known only the simplest of human encampments. The texts describe the arrival of the first 50. They are called the Anunnaki of the 50, a small, specialized team led by a figure the later Babylonians would call Ea and the Sumerians knew as Enki. In the traditional myths, Enki is the god of water and wisdom. But if we peel back the skin of the myth, we see a lead engineer. We see a master of logistics. We see a survivor who has just crossed the most hostile environment imaginable to find a foothold on a planet that is not his own. The craft they arrive in are not chariots of fire in the sense of divine magic. The texts describe them as great birds of heaven that emit a roar like a storm. When they touch down in the marshlands, they do not find a paradise. They find a lethal, humid, and chaotic swamp. The heat of the Mesopotamian sun is oppressive. The air is thick with moisture. The ground is a shifting maze of reeds and silt. For a species that has spent untold time in the sterile, controlled environment of a long-distance vessel, Earth is a biological assault. The first task is not to build a temple. It is to find water. This is the great irony of Enki being the god of water. The Sumerian tablets tell us that he spent his first days on Earth draining the marshes and directing the flow of the rivers. In a religious context, this is a miracle. In a survivalist context, this is basic civil engineering. The fresh water was trapped beneath the surface or hidden in the brackish lagoons. To survive, the Anunnaki needed to separate the sweet water from the salt. This is why Enki is associated with the Abzu, the deep subterranean reservoir. It was his first successful project, his first victory over the harshness of the New World. The early tablets, such as the Eridu Genesis, describe the construction of the first house. This was the Iabzu, the house of the deep waters. It was not a place of worship originally. It was a headquarters. It was a laboratory. It was a sanctuary where the survivors could escape the crushing atmospheric pressure and the blinding ultraviolet rays of a sun that was far more intense than what they were adapted to. The texts say that Enki raised the city from the mud. He used the local materials, the reeds and the clay, but he infused them with a structure that was alien to the local environment. The narrative of the landing is one of profound exhaustion. There is no mention of a grand welcome committee. There are no kings to greet them because kingship, according to the Sumerian king list, had not yet descended from heaven. The Anunnaki were alone. They were the first inhabitants of a new wilderness. The Sumerian word for these beings, Anunna, literally means those of the royal seed, or those who are of the heavens. It is a title of heritage, not of divinity. It marks them as a people with a lineage that trace back to a place that is no longer accessible. As they established Eridu, the psychological weight of their situation began to set in. They were refugees. The texts hint at a sense of profound isolation. The great distance between Earth and their home meant that there was no immediate hope of return. They had to make this world work. They had to transform the marsh into a garden, not because they wanted to create a beautiful park, but because they needed a controlled ecosystem to produce food and to sustain their unique biology. The Garden of Eden, which find its roots in these Sumerian descriptions of the Eden, was not a gift from a creator. It was a hard-won reclamation project. The Anunnaki were the first gardeners because they were the first to understand that the natural state of the earth was too wild for their continued existence. They dug the canals. They cleared the silt. They planted the seeds they had brought with the foresight of those who knew they would never see their original home again. The Sumerian king list begins with a simple, chilling statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. If we replace the word kingship with command or mission, the sentence changes its character entirely. It marks the moment the first command center was established. It marks the moment the survivors took control of their environment. The reigns of these early leaders are listed in tens of thousands of years. While traditional historians dismiss these numbers as mythological exaggerations, they might instead point to a different understanding of time, or perhaps a different biological clock. To a survivor from a world with a different orbital period or a more advanced grasp of genetics, a human lifetime would seem like the blink of an eye. The landing at Eridu was the foundation of everything that followed. It was the moment the trajectory of Earth was permanently altered. But it was also a moment of immense vulnerability. If the pumps had failed, if the first crops had died in the saline soil, the story of the Anunnaki would have ended in the mud of the Persian Gulf. They were not all-powerful. They were not immortal in the sense of being beyond death. They were simply better equipped and more desperate than anything else on the planet. The archaeological evidence at Eridu shows that the first small shrine was built directly over a source of fresh water. Over the millennia, this shrine grew into a massive ziggurat, a mountain of brick that dominated the horizon. But at the very bottom, at the foundation, is a simple room. It is a room that speaks of a time when 50 individuals sat in the dark, listening to the wind howl across a marshland they did not yet understand, and planned their next move. They were survivors who had lost their past and were forced to build a future out of the very dirt beneath their feet. The splendor of the later Sumerian civilization, with its complex laws and towering temples, was the distant echo of this first desperate struggle. The Anunnaki were not looking for worshippers. They were looking for a way to stay alive. The worship came later, born from the awe of the local primitive humans who watched as these strangers turned the swamp into a city. To the locals, the ability to control the water and the stars was the mark of a god. To the Anunnaki, it was simply the price of admission to a new home. As the sun sets over the ruins of Eridu today, the silence is absolute. The water has long since retreated, leaving only the salt and the sand. But the records remain. The baked clay of the tablets preserves the memory of those first days. They speak of the labor. They speak of the heat. They speak of Enki and his crew, standing on the edge of the world, realizing that they were no longer travelers. They were inhabitants. The landing at Eridu was the first step in a long, complicated relationship between this planet and its unwanted guests. It was the moment the refugees became the masters. But in those first few years, the mastery was an illusion. They were at the mercy of the earth. Every canal dug was a battle against the silt. Every day survived was a victory against the environment. They were not gods descending to a playground. They were survivors who had just crashed into the only lifeboat they had left. The story of Eridu is the story of the first colony, but it is also the story of the first exile. The garden was a prison as much as it was a sanctuary. And as the 50 survivors looked out over the endless expanse of the Mesopotamian marshes, they knew that the world they had left behind was gone. The only thing that mattered now was the mud, the water, and the will to endure. This was the beginning of the Anunnaki era on Earth. Not a golden age of divine rule, but a gritty, difficult struggle to rebuild a shattered civilization in the most unlikely of places. Deep within the sweltering heat of the southern African continent, in the region the Sumerian texts call the Abzu, the veneer of a sophisticated civilization begins to crack. This is not a paradise. It is an industrial landscape. For centuries, the labor of extraction has fallen upon the shoulders of the Ijiji, the lower rank of the Anunnaki survivors. They are the technicians, the miners, and the builders who have kept this displaced society functioning. But the atmosphere of the earth is heavy, and the work of dredging the riverbeds and delving into the deep veins of the earth is relentless. The Sumerian tablets describe a growing resentment, a slow-burning fuse among those who feel they have been relegated to the status of beasts of burden. The historical record in the Atrahasis epic is startlingly specific. It describes the Igigi as being weary of the toil. They have spent 40 periods, perhaps years or perhaps much longer cycles, laboring in the heat. They decide that the burden is too great. In an act of open mutiny, they set fire to their tools and surround the dwelling of Enlil, the commander of the mission. This is a moment of existential crisis for the Anunnaki. Without the labor of the Igigi, the infrastructure of their colony will collapse. They are far from home, their resources are finite, and their survival depends on the continued extraction of materials they need to maintain their technology and perhaps even their biological health. The narrative shifts from the open fields of rebellion to the high councils of the leadership. We see a clash of philosophies between the two brothers who lead the survivors. Enlil, the disciplinarian, demands the leaders of the rebellion be executed. He sees the strike as a threat to the order of their society. But Enki, the scientist and engineer, proposes a different path. He understands that the Igigi are right. The work is too difficult for their kind. He offers a technological solution to a labor problem. He suggests the creation of a surrogate, a biological entity that can shoulder the burden of the work. Enki proposes the creation of what the texts call the Lulu, a primitive worker. He does not suggest creating life out of nothing, but rather the modification of an existing life form. The Sumerian tablets describe a creature that already exists on the earth, a being that is primitive yet possesses the physical capacity for labor. In modern scientific terms, we might recognize this as a species of hominid, perhaps Homo erectus, roaming the African savanna. Enki sees this creature not as an animal, but as a biological chassis that can be upgraded. The scene shifts to the Bit Shimti, the house of life. This is no temple for prayer. The descriptions in the ancient texts suggest a laboratory, a place of specialized equipment and sterile environments. Joining Enki in this endeavor is Ninhursag, also known as Ninmah, the chief medical officer of the Anunnaki. She is a master of biology and genetics. Together, they begin the process of the alchemy of necessity. This is the moment where myth and molecular biology seem to converge in a startlingly modern way. The tablets speak of the purification of the clay. In the context of a survivor's narrative, clay is likely a metaphor for biological material or perhaps the mineral-rich medium used in genetic sequencing. They speak of the blood of a god being mixed with the clay. If we look at this through the lens of a high-technology civilization, blood is the carrier of DNA. The texts suggest that one of the Anunnaki, a leader who had the intelligence and the temperament desired for the new species, was sacrificed or at least provided the genetic template. His essence, his te'ima, meaning personality or memory, and his shiru, meaning flesh or life force, are integrated into the primitive earth creature. The process is long and fraught with difficulty. The Sumerian texts do not describe a magical, instantaneous creation. Instead, they recount a series of experiments and failures. Ninhursag and Enki produce several iterations of the creature that are flawed. Some are born with physical deformities, some lack the intelligence to follow instructions, and some are unable to reproduce. These are the monsters of myth, the half-formed beings that appear in ancient lore across the globe. From a documentary perspective, these descriptions look less like divine whims and more like the trial and error of a geneticist working with a difficult and alien genome. The The scientists are under immense pressure. The Ijiji are still on strike, and the stability of the colony hangs in the balance. Finally, after countless attempts, a breakthrough occurs. They create a creature that is the perfect hybrid. It possesses the strength and hardiness of the native Earth hominid, but it has been gifted with the intelligence and manual dexterity of the Anunnaki. This is the Adamu. The word itself is rooted in the Sumerian for dark-colored earth or blood. It is a creature of two worlds, a bridge between the stars and the soil. The birth of the Adamu is not celebrated with a sense of wonder, but with a sense of relief. The new species is immediately put to work. They are the new workforce, the biological robots designed to handle the heavy lifting that the Ijiji refused to do. The texts describe the Anunnaki placing the yoke upon the human race. This is the pivotal moment in our hidden history. According to these ancient records, we were not created for a grand purpose or as the pinnacle of a divine plan. We were engineered for utility. We were the solution to a labor dispute in a struggling colony of survivors. The documentary camera moves through the imagined corridors of the House of Life, where rows of gestation vats might have once stood. We see the transition of the human form from a natural product of evolution to a curated product of engineering. The Anunnaki have successfully offloaded the cost of their survival onto a new, subservient species. But in doing so, they have changed the trajectory of the planet forever. They have introduced a foreign element into the biosphere of the Earth, a spark of their own sophisticated intelligence trapped within a primitive frame. As the Adamu began to populate the mining camps and the cities of the Anunnaki, a new dynamic emerged. The survivors were no longer alone. They were now the masters of a burgeoning population that looked like them, spoke like them, and shared a portion of their very code. This was a dangerous gamble. By creating a servant with their own intelligence, the Anunnaki had sowed the seeds of a future conflict. The humans were more than just tools. They were sentient beings who could observe their creators, learn from them, and eventually question the nature of their own existence. The Sumerian texts suggest that Enki developed a paternalistic bond with his creation. He watched them grow and adapt. He saw that they were capable of more than just digging in the dirt. But Enlil, the commander, remained wary. To him, the humans were a temporary measure, a necessary evil that could become a nuisance if they were allowed to proliferate without control. The tension between the two brothers, once focused on the rebellion of the Ijiji, now shifted to the management of this new human species. In the laboratories of the Abzu, the alchemy was complete. The survivors had successfully manipulated the building blocks of life to ensure their own continuity. They had rewritten the laws of nature to serve their immediate needs. But the consequences of this engineering would ripple through the millennia. The humans were now a permanent fixture of the Earth, a biological legacy of a civilization that was desperately trying to keep its own light from flickering out. The documentary lens pulls back to show the vastness of the ancient world, the sprawling mines, the rising ziggurats, and the growing crowds of workers moving through the dust. We are looking at the foundation of our civilization, built not on the grace of gods, but on the ingenuity and desperation of a group of people who had lost their home and were determined to survive at any cost. The engineering of the human species was the ultimate act of survival, a technological bridge across the gap of extinction. But as the human population grew, the Anunnaki would find that their creation was more complex and more difficult to control than they ever could have anticipated. This was the beginning of a new era, where the line between creator and created would become increasingly blurred, and the survivors would have to reckon with the spirit they had breathed into the dust of the earth. the atmosphere of the ancient world changes. The air grows heavy and the winds carry a scent of salt and ozone that the inhabitants of the Mesopotamian plains have never known. In the high command of the Anunnaki, the atmosphere is equally heavy but for a different reason. They are not looking at the sky with wonder or prayer. They are looking at data. They are observing the shifting of the tectonic plates and the wobbling of the planetary axis. They know that the ice caps are failing. They know that the sea is coming. In the traditional religious interpretation, the Great Flood is a divine punishment for the sins of humanity. But when the Sumerian tablets are read as a technical log, the story shifts. The disaster is not a moral judgment. It is a predictable geological event that the Anunnaki lack the resources or the will to stop. The texts tell us that the decision is made in the highest council. Enlil, the commander of the mission, sees the coming tide as an opportunity to solve a problem. The human population has become too numerous and too loud. Their presence interferes with the operations of the survivors. He orders a vow of silence. The Anunnaki are forbidden from warning their creations. They are instructed to let the waters take what they will. But one among them refuses to let the species perish. Enki, the scientist and the engineer who played a primary role in the creation of the workers, chooses to circumvent the order. He does not speak directly to the man known as Ziusudra. Instead, he speaks to the wall of a reed hut. He whispers the instructions to the reeds, knowing that Ziusudra is listening on the other side. He provides the dimensions. He provides the blueprints. This is not a request for a wooden barge. The Sumerian descriptions suggest a vessel that is sealed on all sides, a submersible craft capable of withstanding the crushing weight of a global search. It is a biological vault designed to preserve the genetic heritage of the planet. As the day of the disaster arrives, the sky turns black. The sun vanishes. The Sumerian accounts describe the scene with a terrifying vividness that transcends myth. They speak of the ground shaking and the fountains of the deep bursting forth. This is not just heavy rain. It is a planetary displacement. The water does not just fall from the sky. It rises from the earth. It rushes in from the coastlines in a wall of destruction that levels the cities of the Tigris and the Euphrates in a matter of hours. In this moment, the Anunnaki are not sitting on thrones of gold, calmly watching their justice unfold. The texts describe them in a state of sheer terror. As the waters rise, the Anunnaki retreat to their ships. They ascend into the heavens of Anu, which we might interpret today as low Earth orbit. From their vantage point above the atmosphere, they look down upon the world they have built. They see the landscape they transformed into a garden being swallowed by a gray, churning sea. The description of the Anunnaki during the storm is one of the most revealing passages in the entire Sumerian corpus. It says they cowered like dogs against the outer wall. They were hungry. They were thirsty. They were weeping. If these were all powerful gods who had willed the flood into existence, why were they afraid? Why were they suffering? The text portrays them as survivors who have lost control of their environment. They are refugees in their own ships, watching the destruction of their only source of food and labor. They realize, perhaps too late, that their survival is inextricably linked to the planet and the people below. For 7 days and 7 nights, the storm rages. The surface of the earth is a chaos of wind and water. Inside the sealed vessel of Ziusudra, the last remnants of the old world are tossed in the dark. This is a survival mission of the highest stakes. The craft carries more than just animals. It carries the seeds of plants, the records of the civilization, and the genetic material necessary to restart the experiment. When the waters finally begin to subside, the world is unrecognizable. The mountains of Ararat emerge from the receding tide like the backs of giant whales. The craft of Ziusudra comes to rest on the jagged peaks. The silence that follows is absolute. The cities of Eridu, Shuruppak, and Bad Tibera are buried under meters of silt. The irrigation canals are gone. The great laboratories and the docking stations are lost. The Anunnaki begin their descent. They return to a planet that has been scrubbed clean of its history. When they land, they do not find a world ready for their rule. They find a wasteland. The texts say that the first thing the survivors do is offer a sacrifice. They burn incense and roast meat. The Anunnaki, descending from their orbital stations, smell the smoke. They gather around the fire like flies. This imagery is striking. It suggests a group of beings who have been deprived of sustenance for the duration of the crisis. They are starving. They are desperate. Enlil is the first to arrive, and he is furious. He sees that a human has survived. He knows that his vow of silence was broken. He demands to know who has betrayed the council. Enki stands his ground. He argues that the destruction of humanity was a mistake and that the survival of Ziusudra is the only hope for the future of the Anunnaki on Earth. He points out that without the workers, the Anunnaki will be forced to return to the manual labor that caused the first rebellion. The tension between these two leaders is the central conflict of the post-deluge world. It is a debate between the old guard who wants to maintain a strict, detached authority and the pragmatist who realizes that the relationship between the creators and the created has changed forever. The flood has leveled the playing field. The Anunnaki are no longer the masters of a thriving colony. They are survivors on a ruined world, and they need the humans as much as the humans need them. The covenant that follows is not a spiritual one. It is a management agreement. The Anunnaki agree to allow humanity to persist and multiply. They agree to provide the tools of civilization once again. They teach the survivors how to farm the highlands. They teach them how to build with brick. They provide the seeds of grain that the Sumerian texts say were brought down from heaven. This is the moment when the transition from the Golden Age to the historical age begins. The survivors of the flood become the foundation of the new Sumerian civilization. They carry the trauma of the water in their collective memory. They record the names of the kings who ruled before the flood, marking a clear line between the era when the Anunnaki walked openly among men and the era when they began to withdraw into the shadows of their temples. The geography of the region is forever changed. The Persian Gulf has shifted. The rivers have found new paths. The Anunnaki must now rebuild their infrastructure from scratch. They establish new centers of power. They build the city of Nippur as a new administrative hub. They create a new calendar to track the seasons of the altered planet. As we look at the ruins of the oldest cities on Earth, we see the layers of silt that confirm a massive flooding event occurred thousands of years ago. We see the physical evidence of a catastrophe that nearly ended the human story. But the Sumerian texts offer a perspective that the geology alone cannot. They tell us that the flood was not the end of a divine play, but a turning point in a physical struggle for survival. The Anunnaki were not standing outside of the event. They were in the middle of it. They were witnesses to the unstoppable tide. They felt the cold and the hunger. They saw the end of their first great project and the beginning of a second, more complicated era. The relationship was no longer one of master and slave, but of a shared destiny on a fragile planet. The survivors had to learn to live with the consequences of their actions and the power of the natural world they had tried to dominate. In the wake of the deluge, the Anunnaki begin to organize the world into a new structure. They divide the lands among themselves. They establish the first kingships, placing a human intermediary between themselves and the masses. This is the birth of the state. This is the birth of organized religion. But at its core, it is a survival strategy. It is a way to ensure that the next time the earth shifts, they will be ready. The memory of the flood remains the most potent story in the human consciousness. It is found in every culture on every continent. But only in the Sumerian tablets do we find the account of the gods who wept as the world drowned. Only there do we see the survivors who realized that their power was not absolute. The Anunnaki were not the masters of the storm. They were simply the ones who had the technology to see it coming and the vessels to escape it, leaving them to face the quiet, muddy morning of a new world. The waters recede, leaving a thick and suffocating mantle of silt over the cradles of civilization. In the aftermath of the Great Deluge, the Anunnaki find themselves in a world that is fundamentally and perhaps irrevocably broken. The high technology that once defined their presence is gone. The flying craft that once traversed the heavens, the advanced metallurgy that shaped their shining cities, and the sophisticated bioengineering laboratories are largely buried under mountains of mud or rendered inert by the loss of specialized infrastructure. We see them now not as radiant deities, but as weary survivors struggling with the harsh logistics of a ruined planet. They are fewer in number, and the gap between their sophisticated origin and the primitive reality of the new Earth begins to widen into an unbridgeable chasm. The Great Deep has taken more than just the cities of men. It has stripped the Anunnaki of their easy dominance. In the texts of the post-flood era, a new tone emerges in the cuneiform records. It is a tone of strategic retreat and a palpable sense of exhaustion. The gods are no longer walking the streets of Eridu or Nippur with the same frequency or familiarity. Instead, they retreat to the heights of the ziggurats. These massive, terraced mountains of sun-dried brick serve a dual purpose. They are bunkers for the elite and symbols of an ebbing authority. These structures are designed to keep the rising tide of humanity at a distance. The intimacy of the pre-flood era, where the Anunnaki and their human workers toiled in closer proximity, is replaced by a strict and impenetrable hierarchy of mediation. We observe the rise of the priest-kings, a new class of humans selected to act as the mouthpieces for these reclusive survivors. The Anunnaki realize that their physical presence on the surface is becoming a liability. Their numbers are not regenerating. Whether due to the loss of their life extension technologies or the changing radiation levels of a post-cataclysmic atmosphere, the ancient texts hint at a creeping mortality among the so-called immortals. The Sumerian king list records reigns that shorten with each passing generation. The tens of thousands of years claimed by the early rulers give way to hundreds, and eventually to mere decades. The biological edge that made them appear like gods is failing as the earth reclaims them. In the shadows of the great temples, the remaining Anunnaki become obsessed with the act of preservation. They direct the human population to build massive archives and to engrave their history into stone and clay with obsessive detail. There is a palpable sense of urgency in these records, a fear that their true nature as survivors will be forgotten and replaced by the very myths they once used to control the masses. They are the curators of their own decline. Enlil and Enki, the brothers who once debated the fate of humanity with the power of life and death, are now seen retreating into the background of administrative records. Their disputes are no longer over the creation of life, but over the dwindling resources of a planet that is becoming increasingly hostile to their specific biological needs. The gold, the precious resource that many texts suggest was the primary driver for their initial arrival, becomes harder to extract from the saturated earth. The labor force of humanity is no longer a small and controlled group of workers, but a burgeoning population that is difficult to manage without the high-tech weaponry and the omnipresent surveillance of the old days. The Anunnaki are forced to rule through awe and the weight of tradition rather than through the direct application of superior force. This is the birth of religion as a tool of governance. By institutionalizing the worship of themselves, they ensure their safety and their continued sustenance without having to physically enforce their will on a daily basis. But even this system begins to crumble under the weight of time. As the centuries pass, the Anunnaki begin to disappear from the records altogether. Some texts suggest a literal departure, a return to the heavens in the few vessels that remained functional after the flood. Others imply a more subtle withdrawal, a blending into the shadows or a physical passing that is hidden from the public eye to maintain the illusion of divinity. The great cities of Ur and Uruk become silent monuments to a power that is no longer present. The temples are still staffed by devoted priests. The rituals are still performed with exacting precision, but the inner sanctums are empty. The survivors have moved on, leaving behind a legacy of profound confusion and a vacuum of power. The humans left behind are like children whose parents have suddenly vanished into the night. They possess the tools and the instructions left by the Anunnaki, but they lack the fundamental understanding of the physics and the biology that made those tools work. This is the era of the mystery schools, where fragments of Anunnaki knowledge are guarded by elite castes who no longer understand the true source of their power. The shift from history to mythology is nearly complete. The survivors, who were once tangible beings with flesh and blood and finite technology, are being transformed by the passage of time into the ethereal and untouchable gods of the classical pantheons. We see this transition clearly in the evolution of the cuneiform tablets themselves. The early records are stark and technical. They list inventories, engineering projects, and clear chains of command. The later texts are filled with flowery metaphors and desperate, heart-wrenching prayers. The people are calling out to a sky that no longer answers. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki is not a sudden event, but a long, slow fading into the mist of history. It is the twilight of the Sky Kings. They leave behind a world that is forever haunted by the memory of their presence, a world that looks at the stars and sees not a vacuum, but a home they can no longer reach and a family that has abandoned them. As the last of the original survivors fades from the historical record, the era of the Anunnaki as physical actors comes to an end. They leave a void that is quickly filled by ambitious human kings who claim divine right by bloodline. These rulers are desperate to link themselves to the vanishing giants of the past. The blood of the survivors is diluted through generations of interbreeding, until the spark of the Anunnaki is nothing more than a faint trace in the genetic code of a rising humanity. The obscurity is total. The survivors have become ghosts, and their technology has become the stuff of magic and legend. Consider the massive ruins that dot the landscape of the ancient Near East. In this documentary perspective, these are not the works of religious fervor or the labor of thousands of slaves building tombs. Instead, they are the desperate construction projects of a retreating elite. They were trying to build environments that could mimic their lost world, places where they could survive the encroaching decay of the Earth and the loss of their advanced climate control systems. But the Earth wins in the end. The stone remains, but the machines it once housed are gone. Perhaps they were scavenged for parts by later civilizations or hidden in deep subterranean vaults that have yet to be discovered by modern archaeology. The silence that falls over the Sumerian heartland is profound and haunting. By the time the Akkadians and the Babylonians rise to power, the Anunnaki are already ancient history. They are the old ones, the ancestors who came from above and gave the gifts of civilization before retreating into the heavens. The transition from a survivor narrative to a divine narrative is the final act of their withdrawal. It is the ultimate camouflage. If they cannot rule as kings of the earth, they will rule as ideas in the minds of men. And as ideas, they achieve a form of immortality that their biological bodies could never sustain. The psychology of the Anunnaki in this final stage is one of profound isolation. They are the last of their kind on a world that is not theirs. Imagine the loneliness of a being who remembers the stars and the precision of a high-tech civilization, now trapped in a city of mud and reeds. Their interactions with humans become colder and more transactional. The texts describe them as irritable, distant, and prone to sudden irrational bursts of anger. This is not the behavior of omnipotent deities. It is the behavior of a stressed and declining population managing their own extinction. They are trying to ensure that some vestige of their culture survives in the hands of the very creatures they once viewed as mere biological tools. The withdrawal into obscurity is also a tactical necessity. As humanity grows in number and develops its own rudimentary technologies, the Anunnaki are no longer safe. A single survivor, no matter how technologically advanced, can be overwhelmed by a determined mob. The retreat into the temples, the creation of forbidden zones, and the elaborate rituals of purification are all defensive measures. They are creating a psychological buffer between themselves and a species that is rapidly outgrowing its makers. The obscurity is a shield that protects them from the scrutiny and the potential violence of their creations. By the time the last cuneiform signs are pressed into damp clay, the Anunnaki are gone from the physical plane of human experience. What remains are the lists of their names, the descriptions of their roles, and the echoes of their long, slow departure. The Sky Kings have surrendered their crowns to the dust of the desert. The world they reshaped continues to turn, largely unaware that its primary architects are no longer at the helm. The story of the Anunnaki is not a story of the beginning of gods, but a story of the end of a civilization that tried to survive on a world that eventually, and inevitably, consumed them. They leave behind a planet that is a mixture of their design and the wild, untamed forces of nature, leaving humanity to navigate the ruins of a golden age they can only dimly remember through the veil of myth. The dust of the Mesopotamian plains settles over the remains of an era that defies modern classification. As the direct presence of the Anunnaki begins to recede into the deepening shadows of history, a profound shift occurs within the human populations they left behind. The relationship between the creators and the created undergoes a fundamental transmutation. What was once a tangible, physical interaction between two groups of survivors becomes a structured, ritualized system of worship. This is the moment where the survivor becomes the deity, and the survival log becomes the sacred text. In the center of the earliest cities, like Eridu and Uruk, the physical structures left by these visitors stand as monolithic reminders of a departed authority. To the modern eye, these are temples. To the Sumerian scribes who first walked their corridors, they are houses in the most literal sense. They are the households of the masters. But as the centuries pass and the figures who once walked these halls vanish, the purpose of the architecture changes. The administrative hubs and laboratories of the survivors are slowly repurposed. The rooms that once housed biological samples or communication arrays are purified with incense. The technical manuals are copied with obsessive precision, but the understanding of the underlying principles begins to flicker and fade. We see this most clearly in the development of the Sumerian scribal tradition. The archive is not merely a collection of stories. It is a desperate attempt to preserve a legacy that humanity feels it is losing. The scribes of the Adaba, the tablet house, are the first curators of a museum they believe to be a cathedral. They do not view their work as creative fiction. They see themselves as the stewards of the me, a term that has long puzzled linguists. In the context of the Anunnaki as survivors, these me are not abstract divine powers. They are physical objects, data disks, or sets of instructions that govern everything from the art of weaving to the complex management of irrigation and the protocols of kingship. The Sumerian texts describe how these me were handed down, stolen, or gifted. They are described as things that can be carried in a boat or worn on the body. As the survivors depart, these physical tools become the most precious relics on the planet. The archive becomes a fortress. The knowledge contained within it is no longer common utility but guarded secret. This is the birth of the priesthood. These early administrators are not theologians in the sense we understand today. They are technicians who have forgotten the science but remembered the sequence. They perform the rituals of maintenance, cleaning the statues and offering food, because that is what was done when the survivors were physically present. It is a form of cargo cult behavior that solidifies into the first organized religion. The transition from survivors to deities is fueled by the vast gulf in longevity and capability. To a human population with a lifespan of perhaps 40 years, a being that lives for thousands of years is effectively immortal. Their technology, which manipulates the very elements of life and earth, is effectively magic. When the survivors are no longer there to explain the machine becomes a miracle. The Sumerian king list serves as the primary witness to this transition. It records the reigns of kings spanning tens of thousands of years before a great flood, followed by reigns that gradually diminish in length as the centuries progress. This record acts as a bridge, linking the era of the survivors to the era of men. It suggests a slow dilution of a biological or technological advantage. The kingship is said to be lowered from heaven, a phrase that takes on a chillingly literal meaning if we view it as a transfer of authority from a retreating group of survivors to their designated human proxies. As the physical presence of the Anunnaki fades, the oral and written traditions begin to layer the accounts with the language of the sublime. The survivor named Enki, described in the earliest layers of the archive as a master engineer and a weary survivor of a dying world, begins to take on the mantle of the god of wisdom and the sweet waters. His sister, Ninhursag, the geneticist who labored in the chamber of creation to stabilize the human genome, is transformed into the Great Mother, a figure of fertility and divine compassion. Their struggles, their internal politics, and their desperate attempts to manage a planet in flux are reinterpreted as cosmic dramas. The survival of the few becomes the mythology of the many. This process of deification is not a sudden event but a slow erosion of historical memory. We see it in the way the ziggurats grow in height and grandeur even as the technology they once housed disappears. The later Mesopotamian cultures, the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, inherit the Sumerian archive and treat it with a reverence that borders on the fanatical. They copy the old Sumerian tablets even when the language is no longer spoken, believing that the very sounds of the ancient tongue hold the power to command the forces of nature. They are looking for the codes. They are searching the archive for the keys to the lost power of the survivors. But the archive is more than just a memory of the past. It is a blueprint for the future of human civilization. The survivors did not just leave behind stories. They left behind a system of organization. The division of time into 60 parts, the mapping of the heavens, the legal codes that govern society, and the very concept of the city-state are all found within the earliest Sumerian records. These are the tools of a survival strategy. To manage a large, potentially volatile population, one needs order, measurement, and law. The Anunnaki, as survivors attempting to build a stable environment, implemented these systems out of necessity. Humanity, the inheritors of the archive, adopted them as the divine order of the universe. The psychological impact of this inheritance cannot be overstated. For the first time, humanity sees itself as part of a grand, albeit confusing, design. The feeling of abandonment that follows the departure of the survivors is replaced by the comfort of religion. The silence of the gods is filled with the chanting of the priests. The empty palaces of the survivors are filled with golden statues. The archive, once a living record of a struggling group of visitors, becomes a closed canon of sacred scripture. The tragedy of the survivor is that they are never truly known by those they leave behind. They are only ever remembered as the giants who once walked the earth, the architects of the world, and finally the gods of the firmament. Deep within the temple libraries of Nineveh and Babylon, the search for the true nature of these beings continued for millennia. The scribes meticulously catalogued the stars, tracking the movements of the planets with a precision that seems out of place for their time. They were not just practicing astrology. They were looking for a sign of return. They were monitoring the heavens for the same reasons the survivors did, searching for the cosmic rhythms that governed their origin and their fate. Every lunar eclipse, every conjunction of the planets, was recorded as a message from the ancestors. The survivors had become the watchers, distant and detached, existing in a realm that was no longer accessible to the common man. The archive also reveals a lingering anxiety about the nature of the human condition. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero seeks the secret of immortality from Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood who was granted the life of a god. This story is the ultimate expression of the human desire to regain what was lost during the transition. Gilgamesh is a king who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a biological hybrid struggling with his own mortality. His journey is a quest to cross the threshold between the human and the survivor. When he fails, it signals the finality of the shift. The archive is closed. The age of the survivors is over, and the age of man, defined by his mortality and his distance from the divine, has fully begun. We are left to wonder what the survivors themselves would think of their legacy. Would they be horrified to see their survival protocols turned into religious dogma? Or would they see it as the final, most successful step in their plan? By becoming gods, they ensured that their knowledge, their laws, and their very image would be preserved for thousands of years. They ensured that even after they were gone, the civilization they sparked would continue to grow, guided by the invisible hand of an archive they could no longer read. The Sumerian texts, when stripped of their later theological layers, reveal a story of profound loneliness and incredible resilience. They tell of a group of beings who, faced with the end of their own world, planted the seeds of another. As we look back through the lens of the documentary, we see the ziggurats not as monuments to the vanity of kings, but as the final outposts of a lost species. We see the cuneiform tablets not as archaic superstitions, but as the fragmented hard drives of a forgotten era. The Sumerians were the first to find these records, the first to try and translate the silence of the masters. They did the best they could with the tools they had, turning a history of survival into a theology of hope. In doing so, they created the foundation of the modern world. We are all, in a sense, the inheritors of the archive, living in a world built on the blueprints of survivors who became our gods. The mystery of the Anunnaki remains etched in the clay, a silent testimony to a time when the gap between the earth and the stars was bridged by those who had nowhere else to go.